Welcome to the 4D Talks, a podcast about the fourth dimension of architecture, aka all the things that architects should consider in their designs, but often don't. In each episode, my guests and I discuss how this fourth dimension can influence our experience in the built environment and how we could use it to make better architecture that serves people and improves their life. Architects, students, and architecture enthusiasts join the brainstorm and let's discover the fourth dimension together. Today, we will talk about artificial intelligence as the fourth dimension of architecture. And I think it should be considered as one because the use of it basically exceeds the three-dimensional world. This technological innovation, developing crazily fast these days, is a game changer for the industry when it comes to time spent on the projects, the role of our profession, the involvement of the clients, and so on. And as my guest often says, whatever we will discuss today will be already outdated by the time we finish this episode. So without further ado, let me introduce the guest. I'm truly honored to welcome today Neil Leach, a licensed architect, researcher, educator, professor at Florida International University, Tongji in Shanghai, European Graduate School. Neil has also worked at the most renowned universities globally, including AA, Harvard, Cornell, IAC, to just name a few. Neil is also fascinated by AI and shares this knowledge with the best of the best through the platform Digital Futures. Thank you, Neil, so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
I think we all know AI is such a broad topic, and I hope we'll try to cover most of that, or at least some bigger parts of it. But I would like to start actually with the generative capabilities of AI, because it seems like it's the sexiest word these days. There's the biggest hype about that. But also it seems like there might be the biggest opportunities these days for architects. So what are those benefits, if you could name a few? And by generative tools, I mean text to image, image to image, text to video.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that's only a small subset of AI. I mean, it's what we use on the whole as in architecture, but really that's not part of the important thing. I would say that if you're looking for what is the most important, you should probably look at the logic behind it. In other words, the GPT system, especially GPT chat as it manifests itself, which is, I think, much more significant. I think almost the problem of architects is they're focusing on these new tools that could produce some quite startling results, and that's almost become a fetish, and it's almost restricting them because there's much more that AI can do. But I mean, architects are primarily visual creatures. They don't believe anything until they can see something that looks good, right? And this has been both the benefit and also the shortcoming of these diffusion platforms that have just emerged, DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and so on and so on and so on, in the sense that the previous version, GANs, or the previous dominant logic of generating images, GANs, was not so convincing. It took a long time to do. You needed to be an expert in computation. And the images produced were low resolution, and all of a sudden, roughly this time last year, we found DALL-E coming on stream for those who had access to it, and then shortly afterwards Midjourney, and they really kind of catapulted us in terms of the standard of image production, because they allowed us to produce these things incredibly quickly on these massive pre-trained models. So we didn't have to train them ourselves, and they produced images that, you know, with renders and so on, that meant you didn't need to know much about the kind of the technological side of things. You simply have to be good at prompt engineering. And finally, the quality of the images and the resolution of the images was far superior, or is far superior to GANs. That said, you know, I think there's a trap in being caught in this, and I mean, it did kind of make people pay attention to this world, but it's become almost the obsession. And there are other things that AI is used for that we don't even think about. In fact, most people don't even know what AI is. They simply think about these tools and call them AI, but they've got no clue. Most architects have got no clue what AI actually is. So, you know, it's a broader question than that, I think.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Also, actually, I'm planning another episode on data in designing, and that is very much also related to AI, meaning simulations and more like evidence-based design based on artificial intelligence. I think we'll also mention a little bit of that later on, but in terms of those generated images, I think on one hand, like that's exactly my concern as well, that we're focusing so much on visuals in architecture, and I think there's so much more to it. And I'm also afraid that with all of these generated beautiful images, we again, maybe not necessarily for architects, because we can just use it as reference pictures, as you know, we can dream big and visualize those fast, so we can also see how those dreams would look like. But I'm afraid there's also a trap for the clients who can also generate those images and be like, well, I don't need an architect then. This is what I want, just please build it that way. What I like about this Midjourney, for example, is that I think it allows for cross-disciplinary collaborations that we haven't really thought that much about before. And here I would like to mention two people. One is the Italian fashion designer, Barbara Ragazzi, who actually managed to also sort of weave these two fields together with some playful images. And another person is Ula Zwierzyńska, who's now an interior designer for planes. I'm not sure if her origin is just from designing interiors in general, but you know, she just played around with the fields, and then she was actually commissioned to design interiors for planes, which is a very, very small niche. So it's also allowing people to play with it, but at the same time actually opens up crazy possibilities for the designers to also work a bit more cross-disciplinarily. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think for now that is definitely the case. And I think that not only does it become a kind of prosthesis to the human imagination and throw up opportunities or potential designs that we wouldn't have thought of ourselves. And frankly, I don't think human beings are quite as imaginative as we think we are. Therefore, it kind of enhances what we can think about and generates more options out there. So it's certainly, and for the moment, it's an incredibly useful tool, although it's limited because every time you do these things, they don't relate to one another. You can do an interior, you can do an exterior, they're not of the same building. So we've yet to work out how to really integrate these kind of the designs into more coherent architectural forms. But they certainly open up these possibilities and allow people, frankly, also not just to kind of cross discipline, to break down disciplinary boundaries, but also to break down kind of boundaries of scale. One person could now produce a building in a day, kind of thing, you know, or indeed could even deal with a large scale project like an urban design. So they're definitely sort of breaking down these kind of silos or these constraints that we had in the past. But I think there's, in some sense, in the future, there's a problem there, because if I mean, I don't know how good they are, but I've been generating fashion designs, and Barbara's been doing architecture and so on, which is kind of interesting in its own sort of way, very interesting. But of course, that means the territory that we architects have occupied traditionally, just as the territory that Barbara's occupied in terms of fashion. No, they're not the province only of architect or fashion designers. Things are kind of breaking down, and that means, and as you say, clients can also do effectively what architects could do. And in fact, let's just be quite straightforward, is that writing a prompt and translating words into images is precisely, which is what DALL-E, Midjourney, and so on do, is precisely what architects used to do in the past. You know, we'd listen to the client would give us some words, and we would translate into an architectural sort of vision. So in some senses, there is a kind of risk that down the road, unless we adapt and manage to harness these technologies in a way that benefits architecture, that we will become obsolete. And I think this is the pressing question right now, that a lot of people are completely in architecture. Well, there are two camps in architecture, let me just say. I think there's those who know about these things and see their potential and are harnessing them. And really, there are only very few at the cutting edge who are doing that. And those who don't know about these things and kind of dismiss them. And the danger is the latter. These people who really are kind of like ostriches, and they really don't recognize this is going to transform the profession. And this came up when I read an article for Dezeen about the fact that frankly, these things will take our jobs away. And they will. I mean, some people, Matthias Del Campo says that no, there's no harm with that. Anybody's who's saying that clearly doesn't understand AI. I would say he doesn't understand AI. It's people like Geoffrey Hinton, the real experts, not architects playing around with Midjourney, that tell us that this thing is actually potentially dangerous, as does Elon Musk. I think the recent the letter that was signed about trying to halt these large language models, and indeed the warning that Geoffrey Hinton gave us about the potential of these things, is really important. So we need to look beyond this kind of like narrow architectural vision and really understand that the overall sort of viewpoint. But in terms of the profession, I think that what we need to, what I often said is what we need to design right now is not another building, but the future of the profession itself. In other words, we've got to be prepared for this. Now, I'm not sure what the answer is. How do you deal with this? And it's an ongoing kind of question. It's developing on a daily basis. But I think the first step is to be aware that there is a problem there, and not to deny it, not to be an ostrich and claim that this thing is not going to do anything, because it is. It's going to be very, very effective. And what's more, I think that what's going to happen in years to come is that we've been focusing just on images. Everyone thinks AI is about that, but actually, what is in the process of development, and I know this because one of my own doctoral candidates at Florida International University is Wan Yu He, who's been working since 2016 developing AI software for architecture, and she's not disclosing what they're doing, what they're working on. But I know personally from talking to her that in 3 years' time, there's going to be software that's going to come out that's completely going to overhaul the way in which we operate as architects. Now, we're thinking about Midjourney, but actually, it's the less sexy world of kind of BIM, that kind of world, which actually is going to be transformed and made almost obsolete by some of these things, that is really going to be the game changer. In some sense, that's the other side of things. It was great that these images by Midjourney, these diffusion models came out, and architects realized, wow, they can do something. But really, the things that are going to be most important are not those image generation systems, but in fact, the ones that are going to automate the entire design process, so that we will be going from data to fabrication in one platform. And I don't think anybody knows about that apart from Wan Yu right now. She's working on with this enormous company in Shenzhen in China. And it's going to transform things. And it's not going to just to simply automate a lot of processes that we kind of rather sort of tedious processes that we frankly keep repeating every time. It's going to be all automated. The kind of the less interesting aspects that you have to deal with, it's going to all automate that, but it's also going to be able to calculate cost and also be able to integrate kind of performance concerns into it. So the whole thing is going to be one automated thing where what you get out is a design that conforms to all these constraints. And that's the point in some sense, is that as soon as you get to the point where the machine can produce something better than we can, then you're asking the question, what is the role of the architects? It's just like with a self-driving car. If you have a car that can drive on its own, why do you need a driver? When you've got a system that can do things pretty much on its own, why do you need an architect? And I would say that, in some senses, at the moment, it's a question of time when these things come through. That's why the fourth dimension is so important, because things are changing so rapidly, and because of Moore's law, they're speeding up, or some version of Moore's law. There's exponential change happening in this at the moment. Because of that, the world is going to be, it's going to be changing very, very rapidly. By the end of this year, things will not be the same. We'll know that. And what's more, in several years' time, in 3 years' time, I think it would say the beginning of this new revolution is going to really happen, and it's going to fundamentally change things. And the point is, it's not just simply us versus AI. That's the kind of the simplistic model or comparison people make. The real comparison you have to make is between someone working with AI and other people not working with AI. And I don't know what the right calculation would be, or the right comparison would be, and when, most importantly, when that would be. But I do know that Wan Yu once commented that she thought that one person working with AI could achieve as much as 5 people not working with AI. Now, just from a very straightforward point of view, you can see on Instagram there are a bunch of, not many, but a bunch of super talented individuals who are becoming very expert at this, very young practitioners who are just churning out a design or several designs every night, every evening, every day. It's just coming out, and which is, of course, amazing. And some of the designs are really good. But that's really what we're talking about, something that is going to be able to completely overturn the way in which we've been operating, and we need to be prepared for that and need to accommodate that. I mean, just one final thought. I mean, I think what happens when you have these silos breaking down and you have people working across disciplines, there's nothing to protect that discipline because others are working in that area. But so too, we should think about this as architects in a more creative way, shall we say, in the sense that, well, we're trying to protect architecture. What if we were to try and mutate and change and see the real opportunities? I mean, so to my mind, the problem right now is that certainly in the UK is the status of the architect. I mean, forget AI, just in general terms, the status of the architect has really been, has plummeted. In other words, the vision that we got from Alberti, that the architect was the person in charge, and that's he redefined the term architect and so on and so on, back in 1450 or so. That no longer holds, given the fact that most building contracts in the UK are design build projects, whereby the architect is not in charge, the architect works for the developer. Well, I mean, my question would be, what if we were to use AI for the architect to become the developer, to take charge of that area? And that might not seem quite as far-fetched as it would, because in the past we wouldn't know what to do. What do we do when, I mean, how do we become a developer? Well, these days, I mean, we've got ChatGPT and it's going to get better, right? It's not that accurate now, but by the end of the year, it absolutely will be pretty convincing, very convincing. It was already pretty convincing, but it's be very convincing. You could go to ChatGPT and you could say, okay, tell me how I become a developer. And then I think the whole logic of what's been developed in AI is not kind of that sexy in some sense. It's more the kind of logic, let's say, of spell check. You know, it's just they put in checks to make sure that you don't make mistakes. And that will mean that you can become a developer. It'll be warning you. So don't do that. It's going to take, you know, and the real opportunity is to really rethink what an architect could be and to take charge of it and not be this humble person working for someone else, but really to be in charge of the whole process. I mean, I don't know, but that strikes me as being the real opportunity that we need to seize, rather than trying to defend our territory against the incursion of others. To really be able to use this platform to redefine what the architect could be, and it could be an incredibly important move in terms of the profession itself. But I don't. I mean, all I would say is that we need to be alert to all of these things because the world is changing, and if we're not prepared, we're going to go under.
Yeah, actually, you've answered a lot of my questions that I wanted to ask you anyway, but let's continue in this direction. At the beginning, I was thinking maybe it's a little bit like with BIM, you know, that at some point, like years ago, they were saying, if you don't use BIM, you're not going to be a good architect, you're not going to be successful enough, everyone's going to work with BIM, that's the future. And then some companies started doing it, some companies use Revit, some people use ArchiCAD. Yet still there are so many companies dealing pretty well without it. But I think with AI it's a different thing because it's a movement that's taking over the whole world with all the disciplines. And what's interesting, I think what it does is also that on one hand, I think architecture pretends to be very creative, but in reality we are actually very old-fashioned, and you know, there is the 5 days a week way of working. There is quite clear hierarchy in many offices. So there are senior positions, there are junior positions. And what's happening right now is that juniors can actually know so much more and be experts in fields much better than the actual seniors. So how are the bosses of these companies going to deal with that, where younger generations are actually bringing much more value to speeding up processes than actually all of these, like, you know, project managers that currently, like, most of their job can be actually done by AI. There is this, well, actually, it's, I think, currently an in-house software, the X-Cool, that checks the drawings according to the norms, right? If all the norms and regulations apply, that's something that normally you would go to a senior position person, he would have to do that, or she would have to do that. You're also paying for this kind of knowledge, like that's also the salary comes with it. Yeah. These days, if you can just run it through a software, that's not the case anymore, right?
Maybe I think just comment on that, and there's several questions in that. But I mean, I think that I was surprised actually. I recently gave a talk to the AIA, it's the American Institute of Architects, and it was actually a talk for the they called it the Large Firms Roundtable. It was the top, the CEOs of the 60 top firms in the States. And that included Gensler and ACOM and Big even. I was kind of surprised because they themselves, I would thought they're going to really challenge what I was saying and dismiss it and so on. But they actually were smart enough to realize, and they were nodding their heads. And I don't think that's the problem. I don't think it's this, because most CEOs could get there through kind of their own abilities and so on. And I think many can recognize that. Many, not everyone, but many can. I think the real problem is probably those people who are kind of in between, you know, who've been doing the same thing for a while. They want to resist change. They can't see the benefits of this and so on. They're the ones who are going to be rendered, in fact, obsolete, I think. And there was once a point, even just going back in history, around 2000, I was talking to the guys at Foreign Office Architects when it existed in the practice. And they were saying they couldn't employ anybody over 40 because they couldn't use the software. Basically, so, you know, and I think that's what's going to come is well, I think AI is going to be pretty easy to use anyway, because it's going to be all automated. But anyway, you're going to have to use it. You're going to have to use it. But I do think that if you want to really secure your future, you've got to be what I would call, what actually Randy Deutsch has this expression, super user. And I'm not quite sure if I use the term in the same way that he uses the term, but to my mind, a super user would be somebody who is really alert to all of this, and who can, maybe he's got a master's degree in computation, you know, and really knows this terrain. And there are a few individuals around the world that do that effectively almost run these firms. I can think of someone like Chargé Bouchan at Zahedid Architects, and there are a few individuals. And I think AI has got a mixed thing. It's either going to be super easy to use. It's a bit like swiping your phone or using facial recognition. It's not that the technology is easy. It's very, very complex, but the use is quite straightforward. I mean, these diffusion platforms are incredibly easy to use. But there's another level, which is, say, those who can kind of look underneath it and try and start work with the software and start customizing the software for their particular office and so on. They're the ones who are going to be absolutely invaluable. So I would be saying that, you know, if anyone out there who's worried about the future, well, you know, just basically find out about AI. And I don't mean go and do some mid-journey sketches. I mean, basically really understand the system. I mean, just to clarify that, I think that, just go to the question of BIM and so on, is that, I mean, what Mid-Journey can do for us and DALL-E and so on, particularly right now, and certainly with ZHA, Zahedid Architects, is it can ideate. It can come up, it kind of becomes like a sketching tool. It can come up with ideas. You can brainstorm ideas for a competition. I mean, they don't mean much, but they're kind of interesting in their own sort of way. Well, what's going to happen when I mention this kind of this platform that goes from data to fabrication, is the discrete operations that happen in an office at the moment that may start with Mid-Journey, then go into Maya, or then into Rhino, then into BIM. That's going to be a single kind of a single process, and that's really what's going to radically change. So I just think we need to be alert to all of this and realize what's happening. Of course, the problem is with many of these developments, you know, they're you know, in the sort of technological world, it's kind of they're kind of hidden because there are other kind of their non-disclosure agreements. You can't say anything, and you certainly don't want to reveal to your rivals what you're working on. So we don't know what's in the pipeline. Well, I know a little bit what's in the pipeline, but that's really the case. There is some things that are happening very soon that will change the world. And maybe just one further comment on that, and that is to say, just this was it last weekend or was it the weekend before? XCool, which was being based totally in China. So in a sense, only dealing with the Chinese market, has now opened up into the West. So the name XCool comes from ex-Koolhaas, effectively, because Wan Yu He used to work for Rem Koolhaas, OMA. But if you think about OMA and how the name OMA can flip into AMO, that's the kind of research branch they have there. The same happens with XCool. So there's now what they call LookX or Looks, which is XCool back to front. That's the Western version, and that's something that we will be teaching in the Digital Futures workshops at the end of July. XCool will be doing a workshop on that, and that's going to take the West by storm, because frankly, I don't think there's anyone in the West quite as advanced as XCool, certainly not Autodesk. I think Autodesk are still a long way behind in some senses. but there's going to be these transformative models, and we need to get prepared for that and recognize that.
I remember myself like a month ago, 2 months ago, I was at this conference. It was mostly about urban design, but AI-driven urban design. And I remember voices from the audience saying, well, why can't we do similar things in architecture? And that it's all great with like analysis and concepts, but what about execution design? And it was a month ago. And, you know, here we are seeing X school basically doing that. Like, I think she was also mentioning already generating details, or maybe I read about it somewhere else, but basically generating details from simple designs. That's also for AI, it's a very simple task these days. And from that straight to construction, that's especially 3D printing with like ceramics and metal.
Oh, yeah, I think the construction side of things is a bit more complicated. Even more complicated to go from 2D to 3D, of course, you've got to sort that out first. But once you begin to sort of realize that the whole thing could be integrated, I mean, after all, a brick is a brick, right? I mean, it's most of the components we use in architecture are kind of a standard. And once you put them all together in a package, the whole process could be very easily automated. And they've already got these kind of rather primitive, I would say, models coming out, that kind of modular models where they can do tower blocks. And we might look at them and say, well, that's not very interesting because it looks like an ordinary tower block. And they do. But I mean, the potential is not in the forms, but in the process, you know, and what would happen if a progressive architect would really use these tools and not just a kind of standard architect. So, you know, that's the writing's on the wall in some senses, and we've just got to wake up to the fact that our whole profession is going to be overhauled in a good way in some senses, but also a bad way. And I would just simply say that, you know, what the dark side of AI. I mean, I was working on a book initially for Bloomsbury, it's about AI in general, and I felt myself compromised because I felt a bit like Elon Musk, who's kind of working with AI in Tesla and Neuralink and SpaceX and God knows what else, at the same time warning us it could be the end of civilization. Now, I don't quite be that extreme myself, but I can see both sides of things, and so I persuaded Bloomsbury to basically split this book up into two different books, one with a white cover about how amazing the angel, as it were, the positive side of AI, and one with a black cover, which is about the dark side of AI. And I haven't done the latter yet, but I've got to say, and I wanted to put it off until later because I'm going to write some more positive books about AI, but I can see that actually what's happening right now is that really I've got to speed things up because we could already get a glimpse of that. And my point would be this, is that it's not that AI is evil. I mean, it's not evil. It can't think. Now, I mean, if you can't think, you can't have any evil intentions. It's as simple as that. You know, it's just a tool. If someone murders someone with a kitchen knife, you know, you don't convict the kitchen knife. I mean, you convict the murderer. I mean, the kitchen knife could be either cut up your vegetables or it could be used to murder someone. So it's not a question of the tool. It's who's in charge of it. So that's the kind of, it's not evil. But what I would say is that the dark side is it's so capable. It is so capable. And again, it's Geoffrey Hinton who's telling us these things. He is really giving us the clue about what all this is. So, you know, we should be paying attention not to Midjourneys, but Geoffrey Hinton right now. It almost, in a sense, for these two books, the white cover book, I mean, it already contains the seed of the black cover book, because I'm saying this is incredible. Look what it can do. It's amazing. And it is. And that's precisely the dark side. It's, you know, it's more amazing than us. And I think one of the comments I made in the first book, which I think is kind of like, in retrospect, I would highlight even more. I talk about the kind of history of AI, which no one else does. They just go jump into Midjourney or something. But I think we need to see the history to understand how it evolved and so on. And, you know, throughout history, there have been moments when people just can't imagine AI could beat humans. I mean, there's so many examples of this. And it's just, you know, Garry Kasparov playing chess against Deep Blue. Nobody thought Garry Kasparov would lose, one of the greatest chess players of all time. And likewise, Lisa Doll playing against AlphaGo at Go, ... and so on. And architects now don't think it can ever be as good as them, that's for sure. And that's a trap. That's a real trap, because I mean, the real problem is that we can't even imagine how good it is. We can't even grasp how powerful it is, because it's beyond our spectrum. You know, in a sense, it is a form of knowledge or information processing, I don't know what you're going to call it, that goes beyond what any human can do. In the same way that a dog can smell or hear smells or sounds that we can't hear. And that's the point. We don't even know how powerful it is. I think we need to change our attitude and not take this kind of we're much better than that attitude, and realize that this is on the coming forward. I mean, I think just to say, going back to the article that I wrote about for Dezeen about how the risk of AI, the response was, there were two responses. Those in AI said, this is really obvious. What are you saying that's new? I think there was something I think was new, but anyway, I did get that response from someone. Versus other people saying, oh, this is ridiculous. There's not a single AI that can possibly match my ingenuity, my creativity. Well, that's the person who's going to be replaced by AI, because they simply are too arrogant to understand that there's now a machine that's operating at a level that we can't do. And I mean, just one main final comment to say is that what often people say is, but AI is not sentient, it's not self-aware, it doesn't know it's playing us against us at chess or Go. It doesn't know any of this, whereas we are conscious beings and so on, which I think is a wrong approach, because frankly, if a machine does what it's intended to do, if your toaster toasts your bread properly, it doesn't need to be sentient as long as it does that job. And I think what AI is going to be able to do without even being sentient is to produce designs that are way better than humans. And when humans are going to say, well, hold on a second, I put so much of my own invested so much of my own feelings and emotions into this design. The answer, frankly, is who cares? Is the design good in the end? So we've got to wake up to all of these kind of questions and recognize that we are not the center of the universe. In some senses, I think Nicholas Copernicus was Polish, right? Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we need to go through a second Copernican revolution, which is saying not just the Earth is not the center of the universe, we are not the center of let's say, intelligent life forms. I'm hesitant to use the word intelligent, but anyway, we are not the center of things, and there needs to be a second Copernican revolution whereby we recognize our limitations and understand what's really happening.
Yeah, definitely. We should change our perception of ourselves, and it also changes the way we then communicate with the clients. I mean, I would love to discuss, what brainstorm a little bit, what the future can bring. And I know that whatever you're going to say must be actually something else than what you've signed all the NDAs about. But if we could try to brainstorm about that a little bit, like for me, right now, seeing already what's there with text to image, text to video, why there is not yet a voice to image, right? Like we could just keep talking about the project with the client and just see generated images on the screen. Or maybe there is already one, or maybe there's going to be one in 3 months. How far could we go? Also with videos, I think.
I mean, those things are quite straightforward in the sense you can just see, you can predict they will be there.
Yeah.
If they're not already there. In fact, my students are all using these in their submissions. Now these days, it's pointless banning these technologies. They can do certain things, and they're using all forms of AI, linking text to images, linking text to voice, and also just generating the text itself. So all of these things are kind of already there. So and that's straightforward. I think the question is to look way beyond that and imagine what is to come. And the problem, of course, we can't imagine it. We can't imagine our own deaths. We can't imagine what AI is going to be, because, as I was saying, it was kind of like it's beyond our spectrum of understanding. We really don't understand that. But predicting the future is always tricky in some ways, because I mean, it's tricky to do that in the first place, but also it's tricky because if what you predict is wrong, clearly some people say, oh, you're an idiot, of course it was never going to happen. But if you predict something that was so obviously right, like you predict the iPhone, people are going to say, well, that was obvious, someone's going to develop that in some sort of way. But I think the real problem with prediction in some ways is you can predict tools. You know that there's certain tools, or maybe you don't know because you're not aware of the non-disclosure agreements, but you know that certain tools can come along, but you don't know how people are going to use them. And I think the iPhone or the mobile phone is a good example, because the people who developed it were thinking about rich businessmen. They were thinking, oh, well, this is a rich businessman. But what happened is when the rich businessman gave the iPhone to their daughter, who was going out for a drink or to a party or something, and said to her, give us a call when you want me to pick me up and I'll come and pick you up. That moment really was when somehow the whole thing it mushroomed, and everybody started using these phones. And of course, economies of scale brought the cost down, so it wasn't just for rich businessmen and so on and so on. So in some ways, the real challenge is knowing not just the tools, but the way in which the tools are going to be used, which we just simply can't predict. And that, in some senses, is what is part of what I would also add to this equation about the future. You know, I think what's going to change is not just XCool, and no doubt other companies will be following them, automating the design process. Clearly, that will happen. Nor is it simply people like Daniel Bolajan, who are the real kind of super users, who are kind of working, in his case, with Carl Pimmelblau and producing very, very interesting and advanced models for their individual offices. But there's also another factor which I kind of sense is going to happen, and that is to say, someone's going to figure out a really smart way of harnessing the logic of GPT into the architectural domain. And of course, it's already been used. People are saying, can you write me a prompt or something like that? Of course, in some straightforward way it's been used. But I really think that there's going to be someone's just going to break through and say, look what I've done. And suddenly we're going to see, holy shit, this GPT thing is going to be unbelievably kind of powerful as a way of, once harnessed in conjunction with other softwares, unbelievably powerful. And let me just make one final comment, because we spoke about sort of urban planning and things. I think the architecture, I would say, is a combination of two things. I mean, Vitruvius spoke about firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. I mean, structural stability, usefulness, and charm, I guess you call it. But in fact, it's really just a combination of performance, for performance questions, you know, whether the building stands up, whether it works, and if needed, if it's environmentally sustainable, and all those kind of questions, versus what does it look like. And I think the logical or the strategic part of that is the first part, you know, and trying to understand, let's say, the massing of a building in an urban context and things is an extremely complex question that deals with a lot of data. I don't think humans are qualified to do that. And when it comes to that strategic planning, this is where AI is so good. It's a bit like chess and go. There's no point in competing against AI at chess and go. It'll thrash you. You know, it's just, well, you know, it doesn't happen anymore. And I think this is where it's just from a logical point of view, a strategic point of view, it'll come up with much better results. And it already is. We've seen from SpaceMaker, it's producing results that no humans would have thought about. But then there's the other side, the aesthetic side of thing, which frankly, it's not going to take long before AI really knows what we want. I mean, it knows what we want in terms of the news already. It knows what we want in terms of books on Amazon or music on Spotify. It's soon going to be able to understand precisely what we're interested in terms of our designs and fit that in. So when you get that combination of the aesthetics, which is a bit more subjective, shall we say, at the moment, and this really objective world of data working with strategy, which is a bit like playing chess ultimately. It's a bit more mathematical question. When you get that, then you're in a situation of something incredibly powerful. So I think that's what I would say in the future, is when those two come together, we're going to find something that is going to be astonishing. But I mean, I myself have learned that you can't predict very well, and in fact, it's difficult to get everything right. But all you know is that things will not be the same. And that's what we need to, as architects, be aware of. We need to adapt to survive. Otherwise, we will die out like the dinosaurs.
Yeah, I think in an architectural field, we are sometimes a bit of dinosaurs already. But what you mentioned about Midjourney and DALL-E, that, you know, like on one hand, it's representation of what's already out there. It's based on specific data that's online. And another risk that I'm seeing.
Oh, wait, no, just I think that's a misunderstanding, because I think the real possibility of when you're using those platforms, of course, it's based on data out there, but you can kind of mix and match. You can crossbreed. So, you know, I don't think it's just repeating the same. I think that's a mistake. And there's
but if we focus on this creative part, then it's for sure the case. It's, you know, getting two things mixed together, then they explode and they come on the surface in a completely new arrangement. I agree with all of that. But at the same time, both with ChatGPT and image-to-image or text-to-image tools, there's also quite a bit of bias and sexism and racism, and that's based on pool of images that are available online. And I'm wondering if, on one hand, I think it's just a representation of humanity and the fact that we are still very racist and very sexist, and well, still struggling with equality. And I'm wondering if should there also be some kind of moral or like ethical question to the creators of these tools to either try model training or like machine training, or should they actually take this responsibility to fight that as well? Or you think we should just play around with it and see what's going to come out?
I mean, this is an easy target, I think, for those who are kind of critical about AI. But I think a lot of it's kind of misguided. First of all, the bias comes from us.
Yeah.
Let's be absolutely clear. So what happens with the diffusion models is they link text to images through captions they find on the internet. Now, there's a famous case that if you put that they used to start, the term gorilla had been used by some racists to refer to Africans, and you'd put in the word gorilla and you get these Africans. Now since then, I think Google's removed the word gorilla from its search just to make it easy. But I mean, the problem is the bias comes absolutely from us. I guess one could possibly calibrate a machine as you can to try and overcome that, for sure. Just in terms of some of the kind of the ethical sort of uses of things, and I mean, one of the comments is that it copies. I mentioned this before. Well, there is a problem in terms of copyright in the sense they scrape data from the internet, and all copyright restrictions are not adhered to. For sure, I think, as I mentioned before, there are kind of unethical uses of AI that we've got to guard against. And I think there possibly needs to be some attempt, shall we say, to control the use of it. I mean, how you actually execute that, I don't know. But I do think there is a lot of kind of conspiracy theories that are not terribly helpful, and kind of fear-mongering going on by people who are just negative about AI. But to my mind, the racism, especially, it's us. It's written into the data that AI is using. AI doesn't think. It doesn't think that, it doesn't make any of these kind of comments. It's just taking this information and kind of presenting it. So we're the problem, I think. We're the problem.
Absolutely. Well, that's why, I mean, we could try to use it somehow to fight it. Not sure if it's possible, but
no, yeah, definitely there are some techniques. I mean, Behnaz Farahhi has been doing that already in some of her work, looking how you can use AI to overcome some of these problems, for sure.
Yeah, before you were mentioning all of these innovations and how that we cannot basically predict it. I remember from the Digital Futures tutoring sessions, there was this one example of, because I think we've also mentioned that modeling is quite a big problem still. So anything to 3D is still quite complicated. And there was this one presentation of making 3D models out of YouTube videos. And I was like, how would you even, come up with such solution? And it's actually working. There are a couple of steps to take, but it's actually working.
I think what was interesting about this, and this is not necessarily a question of AI itself, but I think what this highlights is really how do you keep pace with all these developments? And I think there's a crisis beyond the architect, the professional. There's a crisis for education for lots of different sort of reasons. I mean, for example, let's say we don't need so many architects in the future. Do we need so many professors? Once we've got AI, do we need 5 years to study architecture? Maybe it's only needs 3. All these things kind of fit in. So there is a problem, certainly. But I think the real challenge right now, with things changing so rapidly, is how can any professor in some provincial university in, I don't know, Poland or wherever, keep pace with this? And it's absolutely impossible. Maybe there's a group in MIT that can do that, or somewhere else, but I think that the only way that we can really teach these things is to have a global classroom, a global platform like Digital Futures.
As a guest professor at so many universities, could you tell me which ones you think are trying to sort of stay up to date? I've graduated from TU Delft 6 years ago, was it 6 or 7? 6, I guess. At that point, we haven't talked about it at all. Like there was one little studio where you could play around a little bit with VR or AR and modeling, and that's basically it.
Was that the NVRDV guys? No, maybe not.
No, I did the Y Factory with them as well, but it was more about like
Minimas.
thinking in a, yes, Minimas, best regards. But it was all about just thinking sort of out of the box. It wasn't really focused on technology that much, at least not the studio that I was doing with them. But there's IAC, which is very, very much involved.
Yeah, IAC's a place I used to teach every week, and it's actually an interesting. Because I was thinking that when you were talking, IAC's an interesting, interesting example, because IAC only exists because that material is not taught in mainstream education. It's kind of filling in a gap, and a very useful gap, and it's very nimble as an institution. It can change very quickly and can deal with these things. It's a very interesting sort of model. In that sense, and my prediction was, well, eventually it should cancel itself out. In other words, once the message has got across, everybody's going to pick up on those things and make that work. And in fact, that is somehow, in some senses, the model behind digital futures. I mean, Philippe Morel once made the comment that really the potential of digital futures is to do for mainstream education what Uber did for taxis. In other words, Uber forced taxis to improve their act. They were so inefficient and terrible. Uber comes along, and in order to survive, they've got to be like Uber. That potentially is the case, but frankly, that's utopian, because in the end, there are all sorts of resistances and people that's not going to happen. And unfortunately, the rest of the world is not going to turn into IAC. It's going to be stuck in its own kind of way of operating. So. But I think IAC is a good example of that. I would say that, if people are thinking of where to study for a master's, the world is kind of constantly mutating, and you can't come up with a fixed view of where to go and what to learn. I think that really depends on the dean, the person in charge, and the people who are teaching there. So all I would say is don't go to a place based on its reputation. Go be really alert to who is where at what time and what they're doing.
I'll definitely keep my eye on that as well. Okay, I think it would be nice to maybe wrap it up a little bit. And my last question that I wanted to ask you was, what people do you think we should follow? Like, who are the leaders that we should make sure we follow the next steps of? But you've also mentioned a couple of names already. So what would be your final thoughts on that topic regarding the usage of AI already by architects, and maybe we should try actually also to convince many to do that, or maybe should we just leave the ones who are not convinced to die off slowly and let the ones who are interested in it take over?
I mean, I don't know. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. I mean, I'm not fighting a battle. I'm just providing information and saying, listen, this is what's out there. Take it or leave it. And if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. It's not, don't see it as a battle. But in terms of who are the people we should look to, I mean, what we try and do on Digital Futures is to get the very best, and there are a lot of AI's become a bit of a bandwagon. A lot of people jumping on the bandwagon. But even some of the people writing about it don't know that much, frankly. And I would be cautious about inviting those to Digital Futures. But we have tried to do that. I mean, we had a session, this roundtable discussion, and we brought in, Patrick Schumacher, who's kind of, despite some things I don't agree with about Patrick, he's certainly grasping the opportunity of how to use AI in a mainstream, but not mainstream, but a kind of large scale progressive practice. He was there, and we brought in Daniel Bolojan, of course, is the person, and Dwan knew her, of course, but also a bunch of other people I thought were really kind of interesting. Ross Lovegrove is an unbelievable individual. He's kind of like the rock star of the industrial design world. I mean, he is the Zaha Hadid, really incredible. We brought him in, and also Michel Roskin, who's a kind of very unusual individual. He's a former rock star turned architect. He's probably the leading architect in Mexico. And he was these were generating bouncing ideas around that was really super, super interesting. But right now, we're in a situation whereby, unless there are two categories, I think, of people who can really be said to know about AI. One is the technical people. That is to say, Daniel Bolojan, Daniel Escobar, George Guida, and so on and so on. So there's a bunch of them, really interesting people. And then the theoretical side, well, I've not been convinced by anyone else actually out there so far, but I think that's going to become an area as well, that we all need to kind of address that and so on. And that's the name of the game. We've got to be able to address this, because it is the condition of our time, and it's not just architecture; it's society as a whole. This is one of the biggest kind of game changers. I think possibly. I don't know. I mean, certainly, the digital revolution was nothing compared to what's happening now. And I think maybe the Renaissance, but maybe it goes beyond that. I think this is such a fundamental watershed in the way that we, as human beings, operate, that we, in order to survive, we need to kind of really change our attitude. That's why, I would go back to Nicholas Copernicus from Poland to say we have to have a second Copernican revolution and realize that the world is absolutely different to how we supposed it was, and it's going to change the whole time, and we need to adapt and revise our attitudes in order to survive. Otherwise, we will go the same way as dinosaurs.
Thank you so much for this eye-opening conversation. That was very, very interesting. I will definitely also link all of the Digital Futures tutorials that I've been already watching, and the many more that will come. I'll make sure that my audience, hopefully growing as well from this episode, is going to listen to it. Thank you so much, Neil.
Thank you for doing this. I think it's an important service for architects, not just in Poland, but across the world. So good luck.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. To avoid the fear of missing out, make sure you follow 4D Brainstorm here and on the other social media platforms like Instagram and LinkedIn. If you want to share your thoughts on this topic, or would like to know how exactly this fourth dimension could be implemented in your design, just simply send an email to 4dbrainstorm@gmail.com. I'm really looking forward to exploring it further with you. Last but not least, if you're interested to know more about what I do, you can also check out the website 4dbrainstorm.com, a platform for free brainstorming in all dimensions and fields. Join the brainstorm and let's discover the fourth dimension together. Till next time!